My first appearance on any stage was in the Scottish tragedy, playing the Tyrant King. Mr. Giles' Theatre in Lindsay Street was crowded head to foot on that most memorable night. They were sated on 3 separate occasions, and plaudit after plaudit of applause greeted my impersonation of Macbeth. Is this the dagger I see before me? The handle toward my hand. Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not? Fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight. Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain?
On that famous night in Mr. Giles' theatre, McGonagall had hired the hall and the other actors for the princely sum of £1, raised by subscription amongst his workmates, so he was assured of a fairly sympathetic reception. But on other nights, once his fame had spread, McGonagall's thunderous voice and melodramatic delivery ensured that his performances in Dundee's theatres and halls went with a bang, not a whimper. The crowds would jeer, cheer, and sing throughout, hurling missiles, rushing the stage, and even carrying the poet off into the night, shoulder high through the streets. On one occasion he is reported to have lost his temper completely and drawn his broadsword, which was a prop, chasing his tormentors back into the hall like a flock of frightened sheep. Was this the kind of reception afforded to every thespian in Dundee, or was it something laid on specially for McGonagall? Stephen Fraser is chair of the King's Theatre Trust, and he's been researching the history of theatre in Dundee.
Something of that kind was probably specially for McGonagall, but they would be familiar with great actors like Irving playing these major classic roles, and they would have had opportunity to see them year after year, so they would know the plays as well as the actors did. And they would be able to tell precisely when somebody was taking liberties or if they'd forgotten their lines and were ad-libbing. The audiences would know this in a way that perhaps audiences don't nowadays.
McGonagall was not above taking liberties with the Bard of Avon, particularly when carried away by the enthusiasm of a cheering audience. On one celebrated occasion, when playing Macbeth, he refused to let Macduff kill him, and fought on, flourishing his weapon about the ears of his adversary in such a way that there was for some time an apparent probability of a real tragedy, as it was reported at the time. But there was no question that McGonagall knew Shakespeare's writing in detail, as Willie Smith, formerly manager of McGonagall's philanthropic printers, can tell you.
He became an expert in Shakespeare. He actually ran classes on Shakespeare. He gave lectures on Shakespeare. He wrote short essays on Shakespeare. He was so involved with Shakespeare. He wanted other people to hear about it as well. And any platform he had, he always quoted Shakespeare. He wanted to act on the stage. That was originally his idea. He believed he could act Shakespeare very well indeed.
I bow to no man but Shakespeare.
Just as McGonagall witnessed the gradual death of handloom weaving, he saw the end of the medieval tradition of theatre. Wood and canvas erections where touring players presented dramas, and McGonagall might get walk-on parts, disappeared as the town became prosperous and turned the marshland of Meadowside into the stately Albert Square.
The tradition of theatre going back to medieval times was that it would have been not on a permanent stage. The players would have used carts and booths, and they would have worked outside the city walls, and the traditional area in Dundee was at Westport. It was only by about 1810, 1820 that there was enough demand to justify building a purpose-built theatre, which was built in Castle Street, the Theatre Royal, which operated until 1885.
McGonagall's obsession with recording great occasions of state is well known, as is his predilection for disasters where hundreds or preferably thousands of helpless women and children are drowned, burned, or otherwise meet a terrible end.
The great Yellow River inundation in China. 'Twas in the year of 1887, and on the 28th of September, which many people of Honan in China will long remember. Oh, heaven, it must have been an appalling sight to witness in the dead stillness of the night frantic fathers and mothers struggling hard against the roaring flood to save themselves and little ones, their own flesh and blood. The Chinese offer sacrifices to the water spirits twice a year, and whether the water spirits or God felt angry, I will not aver, but Perhaps God has considered such sacrifices a sin, and has drowned so many thousands of them for not worshipping him.
He sucks up to the establishment outrageously at times, composing paeans of praise to Queen Victoria and chronicling in loving detail the heroic acts of British Army generals in battle. But less well known is his political poetry. Two of his themes were temperance and women's suffrage. Let's start with temperance, and note briefly that unlike some of his contemporary writers, McGonagall needed neither drink nor drugs to fuel his imagination.
I dreamt a dream the other night, that an angel appeared to me clothed in white. Oh, it was a beautiful sight, such as filled my heart with delight. And in her hand she held a flaming brand, which she waved above her head most grand, and on me she glared with love-beaming eyes. Then she commanded me from my bed to arise, and in a sweet voice she said, "You must follow me, and in a short time you shall see the destruction of all the public houses in the city, which is, my friend, the God of heaven's decree."
Faced with this awesome vision, McGonagall is undaunted. He throws on his clothes and rushes to the city square, where he finds the angel, no apostle of peaceful protest, addressing a crowd of 5,000 angry men.
"Gentlemen belonging the fair city of Dundee, remember I have been sent here by God to warn ye, that by God's decree ye must take up arms and follow me, and wreck all the public houses in this fair city, because God cannot countenance such dens of iniquity. Therefore, friends of God, come, follow me." And while the angel was thus addressing the people, the devil seemed to be standing on the townhouse steeple, foaming at the mouth with rage, and seemingly much annoyed, and kicking the steeple because the public houses were going to be destroyed.
What a glorious picture McGonagall paints of the devil kicking the townhouse steeple! No doubt he was subconsciously wreaking revenge on some of the publicans who had thrown wet towels at him to cut short his entertainments because he was keeping the punters away from the bar. Just how off the wall was McGonagall in his desire to ban strong drink from the land? Did others support his views? Here's Dundee University's Chris Watley.
There was a strong temperance tradition in Scotland. The temperance issue was very, very much live in Dundee. So no, he's not out of time. It sounded odd then. I mean, even then there was a great deal of opposition from the drinking classes to the activities of temperance reformers. But nevertheless, no, it's not odd, and indeed it was very often autodidacts such as McGonagall who would join the temperance campaign, if you like. He was certainly a man of courage, and he did not only go into pubs and sell his poems, but he also appeared on stage, on stages and on platforms where he was booed, where things were thrown at him, and he was forced to flee.
McGonagall might have been expected to support temperance, but here's a poem which must have surprised and angered many of his male contemporaries, unless they just wrote it off as another mad effusion of an idiot.
"Fellow men, why should the Lords try to despise and prohibit women from having the benefit of the parliamentary franchise? When they pay the same taxes as you and me, I consider they ought to have the same liberty, and I consider, if they are not allowed the same liberty, from taxation every one of them should be set free, and if they are not, it is really very unfair, and an act of injustice I most solemnly declare."
Leah Leneman is a historical researcher and author, and an acknowledged expert in the campaign for women's suffrage. What was McGonagall actually supporting when he wrote that poem?
Well, I think most people, if they think about suffrage, they think about the suffragettes, which was the militant movement, which was started by the Pankhursts after 1906. And what they don't realise was that women's suffrage movement existed in Scotland from 1867, the time of the Second Reform Act, onwards. And there were petitions and talks and activities throughout Scotland during that whole period. So McGonagall and everybody in Scotland, at least the educated classes, would have been aware of the fact that women were fighting for the vote. The vote was not the only thing they were fighting for in Victorian Scotland. I mean, they were fighting for higher education and legal rights and all sorts of things. By the 1880s, They'd won a lot of those things, but they still hadn't won the vote. In fact, it wasn't until 1882 that they even won the municipal franchise. In other words, before that, they couldn't even vote for their local councillors.
But the time is not far distant. I most earnestly trust when women will have a parliamentary vote, and many of them, I hope, will wear a better petticoat.
It is true that many men had a very different opinion on the suffragette, on the question of women's votes in the late 19th century. But they were men, artisans, trade unionists, who were threatened by the idea of a change in the family structure. McGonagall, as a handloom weaver, with nothing to lose in a sense, wasn't in that same situation. But I think it is interesting that he spoke publicly for the suffragette cause. It's not all that surprising in the Dundee context because, of course, while the mill and factory workers, the female mill and factory workers who dominated the Dundee textile trade, were not active leaders of the suffragette movement in Dundee. They appear to have been fairly strong supporters of that movement, in as much as Dundee is. McGonagall is moving in those circles. I think it's not all that surprising, but it is nevertheless unusual for a man to be taking that view.
Dundee Town Council, in fact, was one of the town councils around that time that petitioned for women to have the vote. I think it's men who came in contact with working women probably had more sympathy with the cause. The ones who didn't were the ones who believed very strongly in this Victorian ethos of what they called separate spheres, that a woman's place was in the home and she should not be exposed to the hurly-burly of political life. And indeed, women who were exposed to all kinds of hurly-burly already. So I don't think they had this kind of angel at the hearth kind of image necessarily.
Therefore, go on, brave women, and never fear. Although your case may seem dark and drear, and put your trust in God, for He is strong, and ye will gain the parliamentary franchise before very long.
I think McGonagall just voted entirely spontaneously because he did support them. He thought they had a rightful cause and he did support them. Now, the thing is, we don't know at the moment if he wrote it before or after the passing of the Third Reform Act. Before that, of course, there was this great demonstration in Edinburgh, all this press thing and all that, and, you know, they would still have hopes. Afterwards, a lot of them got very discouraged, and there's no question that a lot of women who had been working very hard for it sort of dropped away. Now, it's possible that McGonagall was trying to encourage them, was trying to say, fight on, because, you know, the cause is not lost.
Even high-minded poets like McGonagall must occasionally turn aside from the great philosophical themes of the day and make a bit of money writing advertising copy. We know McGonagall tried it at least twice. Here's Willie Smith, or Willie McGonagall Smith, as his old mentor Loudon Macartney used to call him.
Well, if McGonagall lived today, he would have been a millionaire. For example, he wrote a little verse to Sunlight Soap. He got a guinea, you see, which is a fortune in these days, an absolute fortune. You can use it with great pleasure and ease, without wasting any elbow grease. And when washing the most dirty clothes, the sweat won't be dripping from your nose. You can wash your clothes with little rubbing, and without scarcely any scrubbing. And I tell you once again, without any joke, there's no soap can surpass Sunlight Soap. And believe me, charwomen one and all, I remain yours truly, the poet McGonagall.
And here's the other one to end with.
What ho, sickly people of high and low degree, I pray ye all be warned by me. No matter what may be your bodily ills, the safest and quickest cure is Beecham's Pills. They are admitted to be worth a guinea a box for bilious and nervous disorders, also smallpox and dizziness and drowsiness, also cold chills, and for such diseases nothing else can equal Beecham's Pills. Be advised by me, one and all, is the advice of Poet McGonagall.